In this episode of Idea City,
I heard the number 2 of CSIS the other day referring to Canadian immigrants as migrants, right? The word migrant is a code word. It's a European term, a security term which says they're here, but we hope they're not staying. But people don't sort of know how to react and say, wait a minute, they're not migrants. They're immigrants, and immigrants in Canada is the exact equivalent of the old-fashioned idea of getting engaged because you're going to get married within 5 years.
Idea City, the smartest people, the biggest ideas.
Story is told that a group of really smart, really sophisticated New York newspapermen got together and held a contest to establish the world's most boring headline. And the winner was Worthwhile Canadian Initiative. So here's a worthwhile Canadian initiative that we try and keep going, which is to say every once in a while we like to look in on Canada. You know, what's up with Canada? In fact, in our internal planning sessions, I refer to it as Wither Canada. And it's been a few years since we've asked that question, but in deciding who should come up here to reprise some of the great talks of previous years, we decided to focus in on this particular subject. So our first speaker in this pod is John Ralston Saul, and he's one of those rare individuals who can actually make a living out of being what's called a public intellectual. He takes the time, which the rest of us don't, to really think through complicated and somewhat abstract things, and he gives us those results in the form of essays and speeches and books. So these days, if I understand him correctly, he's trying in an effort to evoke and foster a new kind of citizenship for Canada. These days, he's been digging around for our roots. On the face of it, you'd say that America is the revolutionary society and we're the products of a colonial hand-me-down, but according to John Ralston Saul, it's quite the opposite.
Well, Moses, it's great to be here. It's an interesting thing. I can't see you. I'm trying to see you. There, my eyes are adjusting. You know, here we are. This is an urban crowd, I would guess. How many people are from Toronto?
A lot.
How many people aren't from Toronto? How many people aren't from biggish cities? It's an urban crowd. It's an urban crowd. That means you're from southern Canada. You might be from anywhere across the country. And in a way, you know, we are the vast majority. We've come to think that the way this country functions is in an urban manner. Our definition of sophistication is how urban we are. And then if you look at that definition of urbanity, it does start with jokes from New York. You know, one of the, and this is not a criticism at all of Moses, who is a revolutionary, and I'm going to end with that. If you sort of look at the history of Canada, we used to think that being really, really sophisticated and urbane and international was, of course, to think that London was the center of things, or Paris. That's called colonialism. It's called an inferiority complex. That's called a lack of self-confidence. Today, we think that to be urbane and sophisticated is to send your kids to a private school if you're upper middle class, urban Canada. Send your kids to a private school in the United States. If not, a private university in the United States. If you can't manage that, a private school in Canada, which is modeled either on something out of England, France, or the United States. And that shows you're sophisticated. That's called colonialism. It's called inferiority complex. It's called mediocrity. The catch term, it's starting to go out, is whenever you hear somebody say that a city in Canada is a world-class city, that's the hint that you're in a colonial mindset. Nobody in London, New York, or Paris ever says they're a world-class city. only people in the provinces with an inferiority complex say they're world class. Now, you're not laughing, which is worrying for me. Because it's true. That's why you're not laughing. And you're thinking about when's the last time you said it. Almost everything used by consultants, how many people are consultants in this crowd? Almost everything used by consultants in Canada, if you analyze it, has its roots in consultancy work done in the United States. Deeply colonial, deeply past it, because most of the stuff is third to fourth generation coming out of the United States. They've already tried it 10 years ago, it didn't work, and now we're trying it in Canada. All right? The idea that here you are, here I am, I live 5 minutes from here on foot, urbane and urban, and still referring again and again and again, consciously or unconsciously, back to colonial roots. Unable to get our act together to say, we're here because we're here, because we've been here a long time, doing some things right here for a long time, and what are the roots of those things, and where did those things come from? And my argument is really very simple. We've been at this country in its current form for about 400 years. We're not a new country, we're an old country. We're the oldest continuous democratic federation in the world, much older than the United States, which broke apart in the 19th century, in which hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed by hundreds of thousands of Americans, much older than any other democratic federation in the world, all right? And for 400 years, in that period, for the first 250 years, the dominant force in the country was Aboriginal. By numbers, by influence, by ideas, and of course by utilitarian method, like how to stay alive in the winter, what to eat, how to get around. We're the only country in the Western imperial experiment where the imperial people came and immediately adopted as their means of communication for almost 300 years, until the railway, the local means of communication. So look at it this way. We take 1% of our population a year in immigrants. The United States, it's about a quarter of that. 85% of them become citizens within 5 years. The United States, it's 40%. Europe, it's about 5%. And they're having a heart attack over that, right? The weakening of European culture, by which they mean race. That's what, code words, right? We're so far out on a cutting edge in terms of immigration and citizenship. It's so original and so interesting what we're doing. Fantastic. Even though, you know, we don't create enough teachers for second language training and we're falling away in all sorts of areas, it still works and it's still fantastic. What are the roots? Where does it come from? There is absolutely nothing in the American tradition. The melting pot is a European idea of making everybody the same, mythologically and loyally speaking, to the European monolithic idea of the loyal citizen of the monolithic nation state. There is nothing in Europe, there is nothing in European philosophy or history or politics which leads to what we do here. So where does it come from? How are we able to do this? Well, one thing you notice is, in spite of the fact that we're doing this and have been doing this for 400 years, with some bad periods, I know that, some racist periods, we've been doing this for 400 years, in spite of that, we hardly have a sentence to put together to explain what we do and why it works. It's amazing. We sort of say, well, we're multicultural. We like diversity. And then we train off a bit, you know, and say, well, we're nice. Or so, I don't know what we say. It's ridiculous. You know, there are a couple of academics who are very good, but we are not able to explain why we do what we do and why it doesn't bother the Canadians.
When we come back.
One of the reasons so many people think we're a failure as a country is because we can't solve in a rational, linear, utilitarian manner. We can't solve a problem like the differences over our Constitution. I believe that the day that we finish negotiating our Constitution and solve all the problems, the country will fall apart.
Get the latest Idealist news, presenter information, and watch streaming video at www.ideacityonline.com. Idea City, the smartest people, the biggest ideas.
If you actually go back, and it could take you back, if you had 2 hours, through Laurier and LaFontaine and Baldwin, whom Preston Manning's an admirer of as I am, and you could go back through history and you find these phrases, these paragraphs, and they're all, you say, where is this coming from? Well, if you work your way back to 1600 and then work on from there, what you see happening is these poverty-stricken, lost, unwashed Europeans arrive and essentially negotiate that they will be adopted into Aboriginal circles, into the circle. And the adoption method which is still the case of the Aboriginal circles, which are different, but there are many similarities, is that there are certain rules to get you in, but once you're in, the real work begins about how you're going to fit in. And sometimes that takes a generation. Sometimes that takes 2 generations. Does that sound like immigration to Canada? Does that sound like Canadian citizenship? Why don't we get upset about the fact that we haven't worked everything out before people become citizens? Because for 400 years we haven't got upset about that. And when we do get upset about it, we have a real problem, because that's when we're pretending that we're like the United States, or we're like Britain, or we're like France, or we're like Germany. That's when racism rises and so on. So what I'm arguing is that in an almost unconscious way, we have designed the most revolutionary and interesting immigration and citizenship policy in the world without ever having a public discussion about the form it takes and where it comes from. And that's very dangerous, because at a certain point, if you really forget how it works, why it works well, you start to get it wrong. And I think there are signs that we could be starting to get it wrong today, because we're starting to use phrases which sound strangely like something from, I don't know, a security consultant, for example. I heard the #2 of CSIS the other day referring to Canadian immigrants as migrants, right? The word migrant is a code word. It's a European term, a security term which says, they're here, but we hope they're not staying. And there was the second person in security in Canada using that term as if it was perfectly normal. And nobody picked him up on it. Nobody picked him up on it until I saw it in the newspaper and I started saying it. But people don't sort of know how to react and say, wait a minute, they're not migrants. They're citizens, and they're immigrants. And immigrants in Canada is the exact equivalent of the old-fashioned idea of getting engaged because you're going to get married within 5 years. When Trudeau wrote the Charter of Rights, he wrote it as a European document defending individual rights. And then we got at it, and we started stuffing in group rights. So now we have a Constitution, Charter of Rights, which gives, and I'm a little nervous here because I've got Irwin Cotler sitting there, but I mean, tell me if you disagree before I get down, that basically gives pretty well absolute protection to individual rights and pretty well absolute protection to group rights. And there's no explanation about how they fit together. Why do we need to understand how they fit together? That's how we run our society. Balancing those 2 things. Where does that come from? That's a classic Aboriginal, First Nation in particular, approach towards what happens inside the circle. We adore negotiation. Anything to avoid a fight. We'll fight if necessary, but we prefer negotiation. We are some of the best negotiators in the world. We're still negotiating our Constitution at, what, 160 years in? No, everybody else would think, one of the reasons so many people think we're a failure as a country is because we can't solve in a rational, linear, utilitarian manner, we can't solve a problem like the differences over our Constitution. I believe that the day that we finish negotiating our Constitution, solve all the problems, the country will fall apart. That actually works because we continue talking about it. So it's not a beautiful, abstract, theoretical object like the European or US concepts of constitutions. On the environment, we're the country which has produced a lot of the inventors of the environmental movement, Maurice Strong, Greenpeace, a whole bunch of people. And yet we're one of the worst countries when it comes to delivery. And this contradiction has to do with the fact that intellectually we're acting like Europeans, and financially we're acting like Europeans or even Americans, and not at their best. But in our kind of instinctive reaction, we know that there's another way, and that other way is not a rational approach in which the human being is above the environment. It's an approach in which people are inside the environment. They're part of the environment. In other words, an Aboriginal approach, what the Cree call Wetaskiwin, living together on the land or with the land, or Tsawak, which is a West Coast Aboriginal idea that all is one, that we are all one with the land, one with what is in the land. Who invented the whole concept, the spatial concept of communication for the world, right? Marshall McLuhan, comes from Canada. Where did Marshall McLuhan get it? Well, partly it came from Alberta, and he himself put it down to the relationship between people and the land, and the uncontrollable nature of the land, the borderless nature of the land, which required a spatial, nonlinear approach. Is this starting to sound like theory of communications? But he really got the technical ideas from Harold Innis. Also, Marshall McLuhan was in a Catholic college, and Harold Innis was in what college? I don't remember. The greatest philosopher this country's produced. You probably don't know about him because he was one of the worst writers we ever produced. But he wrote a book towards the end of his career called The Bias of Communication, which Marshall McLuhan wrote the introduction to and said, this is where the ideas come from. Where did Harold Innis get the ideas? Well, Harold Innis spent a good part of his life after he came out of the trenches going through the river systems of Canada, trying to understand the fur trade, not as a kind of linear commercial activity, but as a spatial activity, an activity which didn't make sense in terms of early capitalism or pre-capitalism or mercantilism or anything. It didn't make sense. It had something else about it. It worked on the basis of people who didn't know each other, on the basis of trust where nothing was written. It was essentially oral. Fortune, the first fortune of Canada, the fortune on the basis of which we built the rest, was the fur trade. It's not some hokey old thing. It's actually, Toronto would not be here without the fur trade. Montreal, Calgary, none of it would be here. The railroad wouldn't have been possible if there hadn't been that foundation of the fur trade. So Harold Innis went out and basically tried to understand what I think we could look at as the philosophical basis of the fur trade, which then led to McLuhan, which then led to Blackberry, which then led to you, or something like that. And the basis of all of that is First Nation. The basis of that whole idea of the non-linear, the non-rational. It's good to be non-rational. It's not good to be irrational. It's good to be non-rational. There are other things in life than, conscious argument. And there's certainly a lot of more things in life than utilitarian management, which is what most people think reason is about, which it isn't supposed to be.
When we come back.
And I could today just name you people like, Tayaki Alfred, Hayden King, a whole bunch of people who you've never heard of probably, but who should be the leaders of this country because they've got much more kind of guts and drive in them than most of the kind of management school people who are all obsessed by management, as opposed to how to change the country.
Get the latest Idea City news instantly. Follow us on Twitter. Idea City, the smartest people, the biggest ideas.
You could actually argue that the way in which the world now thinks about modern communications, the spatial, nonlinear way, is entirely a product of Canada and has its roots entirely within First Nations civilization and philosophy. Now, you haven't left yet, so that's a good sign. But think about that. It's actually quite interesting. When you start thinking about yourself in these terms, it changes radically the way you think about yourselves. There's nothing wrong with being urban. 50% of the Aboriginal population of Canada lives in cities. Many of them in Western cities, about 70,000, 80,000 in Toronto. And there are now 30,000 Aboriginals in post-secondary education, double what it was 10 years. It should be 90,000. If you listen to the news, you'd think everything was a failure. It's doubled in 10 years. And in about 40 years, it's gone from a handful of people to 30,000. They've got some of the finest young leaders in the country. If you asked me to form the federal cabinet today, and I could pick anybody I want, about 50% of them would be First Nation. And the reason is very simple. Because when I go across this country and I meet young people, and I look for the kind of people who I would want to put in charge of my future, I look for people who are lean, well-educated, smart, highly conscious, furious, angry with good reason, and ready to do stuff. Sounds like Francophones in the 1960s, sounds like some Westerners in the 1980s, and it sounds like Aboriginals today. And I could today just name you people like, Tayaki Alfred, Hayden King, a whole bunch of people who you've never heard of probably, but who should be the leaders of this country because they've got much more kind of guts and drive in them than most of the kind of management school people who are all obsessed by management, as opposed to how to change the country. So the last comment would be this. When the Europeans and others arrived here, because very soon there were others, remember that the Loyalists were not English. They were largely German, Catholic Scots and Irish, black freed slaves, and Aboriginal. And there were a few English. The lie about the Loyalists, that they were, these upper middle class, anti-democratic people frightened of the revolution in the United States. They were actually minorities frightened of a civil war in the United States between the English from England and the English in the United States. Look at who signed the Declaration of Independence. You won't find many minorities in there. Anyway, there were about 2 million, apparently, First Nations people when the Europeans arrived. A few hundred and then a few thousand Europeans. And it took a very long time to get this place going from the point of view of the immigrants and the new Canadians. And that number of 2 million held until well into the 19th century. And it really only collapsed started collapsing seriously in around 1870, and then it plummeted because of disease and the destruction of hunting patterns and so on. It plummeted to about 175,000, which is what gave the people who wanted to take over everything the sense that this was a dying civilization or civilizations, and they were going to help them out completely. Today, there are 1.2 to 1.3 million Aboriginals in this country, fastest growing population in the country. There will soon be 1.3, there will soon be 1.5, there will soon be 2 million, there will soon be 5 million. And that's fabulous. Stop listening to the people who tell you that it's problematic there are all these young Aboriginal kids. What's missing are the programs for these kids. What we need is the largest possible number of Aboriginals in this country because they make up the founding pillar of the 3 pillars upon which this country is based. And they make up the source, the roots of the ideas upon which we act when we're acting at our best. Thank you very much.
Hang on.
1 second.
Unbelievable. Thank you, John.
I love having that machine.
That's outstanding.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You know, it's by having public conversations that things happen. We have to find as many new ways as there are to put ideas out that aren't the kind of pablum of every day and break the stereotypes and the linear approaches. So I think this is a great opportunity for people to throw out ideas, and you've got a big audience who I think can pick up on the ideas they want and take them away and talk to other people. Word of mouth is still the most powerful thing out there.
We're taking one more. They like, yeah, this is good. This is very good.
Thank you. Thank you.